Good morning. I want to start our time off this morning by asking you a question. Have you ever found yourself in a situation and you think, how did I get here? How did I end up in this place? Perhaps this was a time in your life when you had made some less than wise choices and you ended up in a place that you never thought you would be. Maybe you looked at your credit card statement one moment and said, how did things get this bad? I don't remember that last month. Or maybe you're one of those who got a phone call from someone else who found themselves in one of these predicaments. This is one of the questions that we're going to try to answer this morning as we start this new series that we're calling Resolute. If you have your Bibles, could you please open them to Daniel? We're going to be starting to go through the book of Daniel. And just so you guys know kind of who I am, my name is Pastor Mark. I'm the discipleship pastor here at Gulfview. The lovely lady on the screen giving the announcements is my wife, Crystal, just for those who are maybe new to us this morning. Again, we're going to start this new series, Resolute. We're going to be going through the book of Daniel together over the next several weeks. And resolute is a word that means admirably purposeful, determined, and unwavering. And this name for the series actually comes from Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, but we won't actually be getting that far this week, but you'll get there. I was looking over some of my notes from back when we did Anchored, and we actually did Daniel in Anchored almost exactly a year ago. It was like the last week in April and the first week in May, and so we're right on target from last year when we did some of that in our Anchored Bible study. So if you have your Bible, Daniel chapter 1, we're going to read through the first 4 verses there. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Aphaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them literature and language of the Chaldeans. Now, if you are not familiar with some of these stories that are going on in the Old Testament, you may end up feeling the same way that Crystal did one time. I was watching the Lord of the Rings, and for those of you who don't know, that's the best out of all of them. There's Star Wars, Lord of the Rings is the best one, just get over it. We have 2 people who are right out of the rest of you. All right, so I was watching one of these movies, and Crystal wanted to watch, and so we started watching this movie, and she got about 20, 30 minutes in, and she's like, I can't do it. I'm like, are you sure? She's like, yeah. I'm like, okay, so we shut it off. Comes back several weeks later, and I'm like 2 hours into this. She's like, what is this? This is great. I'm like, I know. This is what you rejected watching a couple weeks ago. She's like, well, I know you didn't get that far. And so sometimes when we get into these stories, right, as we're here in Daniel, there's a lot that's going on. And if you don't know some of the backstory, it may be difficult for you to kind of connect the pieces. So our goal this morning is to give you the backstory so that when we get into the meat of Daniel, right, you can feel the weight of some of the things that are happening and help us to have a better perspective on that. One of the times, now most of the time we'll be actually in the book of Daniel, except for this morning. We won't be in the book of Daniel for most of our time. This morning we're going to attempt something that we did in Anchor 2. We're going to attempt to do roughly 1,500 years of history in about 45 minutes. So, we, again, 2 people who are right, excited over on this far side. So my hope is, maybe you're wondering, why are we going back that far? Again, my hope is that you'll understand when we get to where we are, some of the pieces, and understand that, and it'll help us as we get into some of these other narrative bits. Again, to really grasp the gravity of the circumstances which Daniel and his friends find themselves in, and help us to understand us as we get to those points. So if you're ready, let's pull out your passport. We'll get some stamps going here, and we'll get your Bibles ready as we get started. We're going to start where all good things start, which is the preamble. In Genesis 3, 1 through 5:32, we see everything started to fall apart. The first humans, Adam and Eve, were tempted by Satan himself, disguised as a snake, and Satan deceived them into believing that disobeying God's command would not result in the promised punishment of death, but would instead make them more like God. A good goal, bad way of getting there. This then severed man's perfect relationship with God, causing this chasm that we've been speaking of over the last couple weeks through Easter, through our last series, what he's done. We showed you that painting and all those things. That was created in this moment. Perfection has now been shattered, and the broken pieces of God's flawless creation are now laid scattered across the cosmic floor. However, despite this new bleak reality, God shines a small light across the darkened landscape of future hope and restoration. In addressing the serpent, we have what is known in theological circles as the proto-evangelium, or the first veiled glimpse of the gospel. This is in Genesis 3, verses 14 and 15. The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock, and above all the beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Here, God says that although there will be a battle between humanity and Satan, that one day the offspring of the woman, a human, would come and he would destroy the devil for good. Although he would be wounded, the damage inflicted upon the serpent would be fatal. God has now revealed that he has a plan for one day repairing the damage caused at the fall. And so this is the first glimpse of that we get. And although this plan is mentioned here right now, God kind of says something, and then there's a long kind of pause before God takes his next step, which comes when he begins to enact this plan in Genesis 12. We come to the next section, which is the patriarchs and the matriarchs. We fast forward, we're about roughly 1200 BC, give or take. It's a little hard to tell some of the exact dates, but we're giving you a rough estimate here. It starts here where God calls a man named Abraham. God called this man to leave his family in Ur of the Chaldeans and travel to a place where God would show them. Now, to help you kind of see kind of what's going on here, we have a little map because visuals are always helpful. This is kind of a map, and so you can see where Ur is. It's right there. Interestingly enough, so Abraham's over here, way over here in Ur. If we go on to the next thing, we'll give you a little bit closer look. This kind of shows you the path that Abraham would have taken. Side note, I don't know that there's a connection. It's just interesting that he's coming possibly from Babylonia, which is Babylon, which is where Daniel and his friends are. Just interesting how that works out. You can kind of see the path that he took. So if Ur was located here, which is where we think it possibly was, then he travels all the way up to here. We find out in Genesis 11 that Abraham's father, Terah, actually gets the call first and moves up to Haran, and then eventually Abraham makes his way down to here, to this land. And then in Genesis 12, 1 through 7, we read of God's promises to Abraham and about his journey. God says in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and then 6 through 7, he says, "Now the Lord said to Abraham, 'Go from your country and your kindreds and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed.' Abraham passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oaks of Mamre, at the time of the Canaanites, where at that time the Canaanites were in the land. And then the Lord appeared to Abram, and said to him, 'To your offspring I will give this land.' So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him." So here in Genesis, God promises Abraham three things. We see this again in Genesis 15 and 17. There's some more details there. But first, he promised to make a great nation out of Abraham. This is an interesting promise because if you're familiar with Abraham's story and his wife's story, they're in fact childless. So it's a little difficult to have a nation of two. So this ends up causing a bunch of problems for him and his family, but that's a story for another day. He also promises him protection and that through him, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. That this is the continuation of that Genesis 3 story, now over here in Abraham. Now again, to have a nation, you need three things. First, you need a people, which will eventually come. You will need a way to organize the people or a governmental structure. This would be the law. It's part of the purpose of the law is to organize these people. And third, you need a place for the nation to live, i.e. the promised land, a land for them to occupy. And if you remove one of these three, it's a little difficult to have a nation. So you need a land, a people, and a governmental structure. Genesis, patriarch, matriarchs. Fast forward to the Exodus. The Exodus is God's great deliverance of the people of Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. This infant nation of Israel has now grown immensely. When they enter Egypt, there's about 70 people that are recorded. When they leave Egypt, there's hundreds of thousands to millions, depending on how the translation works with the numbers, but it's a lot more than two, as we'll see. Jacob's descendants have moved from Canaan to Egypt after they were... there was a famine going on, so they moved to Egypt, and then they become in bondage to Pharaoh there. And after a period of about 400 years, they cry out to God for deliverance. So after 4 centuries of slavery, the people of Israel cry out to God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for deliverance. And God preserves the life of a man named Moses, an Israelite that is raised in Pharaoh's household. And God meets with him in the form of a burning bush and calls him to lead the people out of Egypt. When Moses confronts Pharaoh, he refuses to let the people go, and God displays his might to the Egyptian leader and pulls his people out from slavery through these 10 miraculous plagues. The people then flee Egypt and cross the sea onto dry ground, and God preserves this band of ex-slaves through the wilderness, guiding them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, providing water from a rock and manna from heaven. And now that the people have experienced God's deliverance and protection, they are now taught what God expects of them. This is on Mount Sinai. Moses receives God's moral, civil, and ceremonial laws, as well as patterns for the tabernacle. So now we've taken the Exodus, and now we end up in kind of our first little hiccup since then. Still at Mount Sinai, the people receive additional instructions before leaving to go to the promised land of Canaan, back where Abraham was promised that land. When they are on the verge of entering the land, their faith begins to crumble. As they come to this land, they send spies out who then bring a report back. This is in Numbers 13:25. At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregations of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Param at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and all of the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, "We have come to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and there is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large." So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying that the land, though which we had gone to spy out, is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are great in height. So the problem with the land is not that it's not flowing, it's not that it's prosperous, it's that there's giants there, and the people become scared and defiant, wanting instead to return to the slavery that they had left in Egypt. Numbers 14 says, "Then as the congregation raised a loud cry, as the people wept that night, and all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, 'Would that we have died in the land of Egypt, or would that we have died in the wilderness.' Because of the refusal to trust the Lord and follow him, their punishment would be to wander the wilderness for 40 years until the disobedient generation had died." This is the story of the book of Numbers, and then Numbers ends with a new generation arriving at the entrance of the promised land, getting ready to take it for a second time. Come now to Deuteronomy, which is 1405. Before the people can go into the promised land, Moses gives them a law for the second time. Why? Because the last generation who got the law has now passed away. The book of this is exactly what the book of Deuteronomy means. The Deuteronomy means second law. And so Moses reminds this new generation of the importance of obedience and learning from the sad example of their predecessors. And Moses stresses the faithfulness of God who brought them out of Egypt to give them this land. Towards the end of Deuteronomy, we get a long list of blessings and cursings that God would bring upon the people if they failed to obey the covenant. So a portion of our answer in how did we get here comes now from Deuteronomy. I'm going to read you some of these curses that God gives, but this is some. There's probably twice as many of them that are specific to the topic we're talking about, but I had to cut them out for the sake of time. But Moses, again, starts off at the beginning of chapter 8 sharing these blessings, and then he shares probably 3 or 4 times as many verses about these curses. And again, this is a portion of answering the question, how did we get here? Because what's happening in Mount Sinai, in Deuteronomy, is God is reestablishing the covenant with the people. The people are like, yes, we'll obey. And Moses is like, sure, I've seen that before. Didn't work out so great, but we'll see how you guys do. This is a portion of what those verses are in Deuteronomy 28. If you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all of his commands and the statutes that I command you today, then all of these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. The Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You shall go out one way against them and flee 7 ways before them, and you shall be a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. Your sons and your daughters shall be given to another people, while your eyes look on and fail with longing for them all day long, but you shall be helpless. A nation that you have not known shall eat up the fruit of your ground and all of your labors, and you shall be my only possession and crushed. You shall be only oppressed and crushed continually, so that you are driven mad by the sights that your eyes see. The Lord will bring you and the kings whom he set over you to the nation that neither you nor your fathers knew, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone. And you shall become a horror, a proverb, and a byword among all the people where the Lord will lead you away. You shall father sons and daughters, but they shall not be yours, for they shall go into captivity. All of these curses shall come upon you and pursue you and overtake you till you are destroyed, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes that he commanded you. They shall be a sign and a warning against you and your offspring forever, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joyfulness and gladness of heart, because of the abundance of all things. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like an eagle, a nation whose language you do not understand, a hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. Whereas you were as numerous as the stars of heaven coming out of Egypt, you shall be left few in number, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord your God. And the Lord took delight in doing you good and multiplying you, so the Lord will take delight in bringing ruin upon you and destroying you. And you shall be plucked off from the land that you are entering to take possession of it. I'm sure that many of us, this is kind of a hard thing to read, but you think about it, God is exactly clear with what's going on. There is no one who's confused. This is half of what's there, all right? No one is confused about what's happening. And before we get on God's case, we do this to an extent in a kind of a lighter way. Let's say you're going to a nice restaurant, or you're going over to a friend's house, right? And you pull up and you park the car, and then you either turn around or you adjust that rearview mirror and you look at the tiny humans in the back seat. And you say, I expect you to be on your best behavior while we're here. And that means, yes, ma'am, yes, sir. That means no screaming. It means no bickering. It means don't touch anything that you're not supposed to. This is your warning. If I have to say anything to you while you're here, you're toast. It's over. Anything with a screen or a power cord attached to it is mine for a month, and you will know nothing but homework and house chores. Is that clear? You can't tell me you never did that. Okay. When the people left to go into the land the second time, everyone was absolutely clear on the expectations. And just so you know, like I said, there are more verses. There's more in Deuteronomy. There's actually more in Leviticus. And so they've gotten this a couple times. Leviticus 26, 33, and 39 also has some of these same things in it. So in essence, this is what God is saying to them. He said, we did the whole wandering through the wilderness thing for 40 years. Didn't love that. So don't think we're going to do that again. So once you get into the land, this is what I expect. And if you're unable to handle that, then this is what you should expect. The leadership of the people is then transferred from Moses to Joshua as they get ready to go into the land. So Joshua conquers the land starting in roughly 400 BC. Israel has now reached its climactic point of fulfilling the century-old promise in Genesis of getting this homeland. And so this was first given to Abraham and Sarah, and now we're several hundred years past that, and we're starting to actually get there. After looking at nothing but sand for 40 years, they now enter this land flowing with milk and honey that was promised to their forebears, and they capture a majority of the land in a 7-year conquest across 3 military campaigns involved in conquering at least 30 different enemies in this short amount of time. There's actually there's a strategy game that we used to play on computer called Age of Empires, and I was decent at it. And one time there's 3 or 4 of us playing, and I named my character Joshua because I was going to go conquer all of them. It worked. I'm just saying. The land is then divided up into 12 tribes, and those 12 tribes are then told to clean up what remains of the other nations that are there. Enter the period of Judges. The work is not yet complete, and each tribe is to complete securing their portion of the land. They, however, do not disappoint to disappoint. We know that the people failed to follow through in the removing of the other nations from among them. Instead, they begin to trade with them. They start to marry one another, and the people's hearts are drawn away from the one true God, and they are drawn to the gods of their neighbors. We then come to the time of Judges. After 400 years of the cycle of Judges where the people rebel and then God allows them to be oppressed by another nation, they cry out and God sends a judge to deliver them. Israel gets their first king. So we go through the cycle over and 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 over. And then God sends their first king. Interestingly enough, we're a couple hundred years from what happened in Deuteronomy, right? We don't have a king yet, but yet Deuteronomy mentions that the king would be taken away. So God kind of knew what was coming up. This is a period in history where we call the United Kingdom. This is from 1043 to 931. The people had moved from a small, childless family to a large group under slavery in Egypt, and now to a nation in the Promised Land looking for their first king. And this was a period of rapid growth and prosperity for the nation. Saul was chosen to be the first king of Israel. We talked about that in our forgiveness series a little while ago. He was the first guy who kind of looked the part of a king, as we talked about. He was tall, he was handsome, he was a good-looking guy. There was one problem, that Saul's heart was divided, and he was only half-hearted towards God, and he struggled to follow God's directions completely. Because of this, the kingdom would eventually be taken from his family and given to another, and that would be the line of Jesse with King David. David was different from Saul in that his heart was fully devoted to God, although we're aware of David's story and that he had some flaws as well. Under his rule, the nation's borders were expanded, Jerusalem was made the capital city, the people were unified, and preparations were began to be made for the temple to God by collecting resources and preparing the ground. And if you think about it, it would seem like this is where God would begin to start bringing back that promised restoration back in Genesis, right? In general, right, we've been in a general upward tick with some hiccups, you know. We had the wilderness thing, and then we came back, and so we had these little hiccups. Although we have seen some drops along the way, you could say that in general, the trend for Israel was upward, coming out of slavery. They are now finally the nation that was promised to Abraham We have a land, a people, and a governmental structure that God is working with, and now they get a king. And this is even magnified by a promise that God makes to the second King David. So this expectation maybe that God would begin to start fixing the rest of this comes in 2 Samuel 7, starting in verse 10. And this is a promise that God made to King David. He said, "And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more." They're like, "No, that's pretty good. We went through the judges thing, and that kept happening, so now we finally get the peace, we get rest. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, for the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all of your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declared to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." So with all this talk, you would begin to think that the whole deal would begin to possibly be wrapped up soon. God had fulfilled his promise to Abraham and Sarah, bringing forth a nation from them. God is now making a promise to David that there would be an eternal ruler that would be coming from his line. And again, if you recall the promise that God made to Adam and Eve, that one day the serpent would be crushed and the chasm from the garden would be healed, all things would get back to the way they were supposed to be. And so you can kind of feel there's a general expectation that maybe we're getting close to the end. David's son Solomon would then take the throne next, and Solomon would build the first temple for God in the capital of Jerusalem. He had many other building projects, bringing Jerusalem to its zenith of its popularity and prosperity. And although he was given great wisdom by God, he didn't always use it. Solomon had a problem with women, or I guess you could say he had a problem with 1,000 women, which drew his heart away from God as it had the people in the time of Judges. Solomon was the last king to rule Israel before the nation would face a massive division that would never be repaired. The prosperity that the nation experienced was very short-lived. Israel had now lived under 3 kings of the United Kingdom for a total of 120 years. We spent all this time getting here. We get 120 years of this, and then everything begins to fall apart again. So those expectations become a big letdown. Any hope that there was for perfection that was on the horizon has now been brought back down, and cracks and fissures begin to show themselves. Once the 4th king takes the reins, his stubbornness and God's providence caused the United Kingdom to be split into 2 through a civil war. Solomon's son Rehoboam then takes the throne, and shortly after, the nation is divided. Rehoboam was not wise like his father, and he continued to work the people hard and tax them greatly, and they had had enough. The nation is now divided in 2, with Israel in the north consisting of 10 of the 12 tribes, that be Reuben, Simeon, Ephraim, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, and Manasseh. You don't have to remember that. There's not a test at the end, but those are 10 that are up in the north. Judah is then in the south with Judah and Benjamin, and the Levites are then scattered throughout the people. So there's Benjamin and Judah in the south with some Levites, so that'll be important for a little bit later. This is the story of 1 Kings 12 through the rest of the book, and 2 Kings. It's also in 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, the first 10 chapters. During this time, there would be 20 different kings in the north and 20 different kings in the south. And all of the kings of the north were evil, and none of them sought to follow after God. And in your mind should be ringing those Deuteronomy verses that we read. In the south, they had only a handful of kings that sought God's righteousness, and God sent prophets to the people who acted as kind of these covenant watchdogs to remind them of what they had committed to. They would call the people to repent from their sins and return to the commitment they had made to God. But often their hearts were hard, their ears were plugged up, and they refused to listen. The kingdom was divided in 2, and it would never be repaired. Because of the persistent wickedness of the north, God's patience with them had run out, and they would now be judged. They would be given to the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom would be taken over by a country called Assyria. God had sent his prophets to them, trying to call the people back, urging them to repent, but those calls again fell on deaf ears. There were people like Elijah, Elisha, Obadiah, Jonah, Amos, and Hosea. All of them served the northern kingdom, and all of them were not listened to. 2 Kings 17. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, which was the capital of the north. And he carried the Israelites away to Assyria, and he placed them in Halah and on the harbor, the river of Gozan, and the cities of the Medes. And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had feared other gods. And they walked in the customs of the nations whom the God drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. So the north is now gone, and all that remains of this nation is 2 tribes with a few Levites scattered throughout. God would deliver the south from Assyria, and he would, because some of those kings feared God, Judah would meet the same fate, but they would last 150 years longer. Not under Assyria, but Babylon. Now, there's another one of our Grace pastors who's retired now, Randy Smith, kind of gives a really good analogy that helps us kind of understand this, right? Let's say you have twins, and they're downstairs, and they're doing exactly what you told them not to do, and they're bickering and arguing and fighting and yelling and screaming and crashing into stuff, okay? You go down there, and you take, what's going on? They blame each other. You take one of them, say, go to your room, you're in timeout. One is left downstairs. The north is now upstairs in timeout. The south is still downstairs. And they play for good for a little while longer, but eventually they start knocking over stuff and yelling and screaming. And God says, did you not see your sibling? Like, they're up there. And they failed to heed the warning. They lasted a little longer, but they end up going in timeout as well. The north is to be a warning to the south, but they fail to heed that. Babylon's destructive power and some of the reasoning behind this decision to capture Jerusalem is actually hinted at earlier on in Kings. One of the good-ish kings from the south was Hezekiah, and it was under his rule that God protected Jerusalem from the Assyrian army and spared them, unlike the north. So around the same time that Assyria is happening, Assyria is taking the north, God protects the south with King Hezekiah. This story is in that same kind of realm. Several years after Hezekiah, the king is protected from the Assyria, Hezekiah becomes sick, and he gets so sick that he almost dies. God again spares him and extends his life for 12 more years during this time, and he makes a big no-no during this. 2 Kings chapter 20, at this time, Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent envoys with letters and presents to Hezekiah, for he had heard that Hezekiah had been sick. And Hezekiah welcomed them, and he showed them all of his treasure of his house, the silver, the gold, the spices, the precious oil, his armory, and all that was found in his storehouses. There was nothing in his house or in his realm that Hezekiah did not show them. Probably not a great move. Then Isaiah, yes, the same prophet Isaiah, said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming, when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stood up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away and shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." So Babylon comes with presents for King Hezekiah because he had been sick. Fortunately, he's feeling much better by the time that they get there. Unfortunately, he's a little too friendly with these strangers, and he's a little bit too open with them, and he gives them the combination to the safe and shows them all of the riches, and he hands them that in a little envelope as they walk out the door. Oh, and by the way, some of these treasures were held in the temple. And it says that in Daniel that some of those same treasures from the temple end up in Babylon. Put a pin in that because that'll be important later on in Daniel's story. So this is how they get there. Now we fast forward a little more to 605 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar decides to come and take some of those treasures that he was told about from his forefathers. 2 Kings 24, in this day, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against the bands of Chaldeans and bands of Syrians and bands of the Moabites and bands of the Ammonites, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord that he had spoken by his servants, the prophets, like Isaiah that we just read about. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem in 3 stages. First, in 605 BC, he defeated Jehoiakim, and he carried off key people, including Daniel and his friends. Second, in 597 BC, Jehoiakim rebelled. He was killed, and Jehoiachin was brought in. He then carried off 10,000 hostages, including Jehoiakim, and possibly the prophet Ezekiel. The third was in 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar then destroys the city, and after a long siege, he takes over the whole thing. So you have a promised people in a promised land, and now everything that we just built towards is gone. The temple, which represented God's presence in the people, is now out of here. If you read Ezekiel, you'll see some of that and why that happened. This is now the lowest of the low points so far within the history of the nation. The northern kingdom of Israel has been dispersed throughout the land, and what remains of the once thriving, shining group is now deported from their homeland and dragged off into the land of Babylon. This is where, again, those ringings from Deuteronomy 28 should start coming in. Nebuchadnezzar, again, destroys it in 3 pieces. I read that already, but I'll show you, this is kind of the map that shows you, this is similar to the one that we looked at for Abraham, right? And so we're basically just going the other direction, right? So we're in here in Jerusalem, and we're going to go all the way back the same exact route, basically back exactly to where we started with Abraham. It's about 1,000 miles from Jerusalem to there, because you can't go across the Arabian desert, so you've got to go around it. So it's roughly 1,000 miles. And again, remember, you're on foot. You didn't drive. There's no Jeep. There's no Humvee, Land Rover. Nope, there's you, probably not a camel. Like, it's just you in a bag. Again, the lowest point of the nation. Again, those ringings of Deuteronomy 28. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away. It's pretty far away. From the ends of the earth, swooping down like an eagle, a nation whose language you do not understand, a hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. Whereas you were as numerous as the stars of heaven, remember, hundreds of thousands to millions coming out of Egypt, you shall be left few in number, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord your God. Nebuchadnezzar is the ruler of Babylon. He ruled Babylon from 605 to 562, and he was largely responsible for the greatness of the empire and its capital city. His name means the son of Marduk, which is the patron god of Babylon. He said, so his name is Marduk, protect my offspring. Nebuchadnezzar decisively defeated the Assyrians, who had taken the north, and the Egyptians at Chemosh in 605 BC, making Babylon the undisputed regional superpower. His father died while Nebuchadnezzar was out with the army, so he raced back to Babylon to take the crown. He then rejoined his army and swept south along the eastern Mediterranean, consolidating this new Babylonian empire and taking different regions and taking them for plunder. This included the sacred articles of Israel, their temple, and in Jerusalem, as well as Daniel and his 3 friends. So he just got into power from his dad, who just passed away, and he's going back on a rampage and taking over these different nations. Nebuchadnezzar greatly enriched his nation and his capital city, largely through tributes from conquered nations and plundered war, including those prisoners of war that we read about. All of this he used for massive building projects in Babylon, his capital. The city's size and splendor were unsurpassed in their day and included at least one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar presumably built the famous hanging gardens of Babylon, these massive terraced gardens with enormous trees intended to console his wife who missed the woods and the mountains of her homeland. No evidence has been found of the hanging gardens of Babylon, but if anything like that were ever constructed, it would have been during this time at the height of the city's splendor. Also included on the list of some of the 7 wonders were Babylon's great double wall protecting the city, which is important later on to the story, again in Daniel, protecting the city reportedly wide enough to accommodate chariot races. That's a pretty big, pretty wide wall. Nebuchadnezzar built or renovated the city's ziggurat, which we have kind of see that picture in the background is kind of represented for Babylon. He rebuilt their cities, their streets, the canals, the bridges over the Euphrates. He extended gardens and parks, hundreds of temples, and the magnificent Ishtar Gate and the major entrance of the city to the north. That's the background. Now we come back to the book of Daniel, now that we've set all that up. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim of Judah into his hand. The Lord gave Jehoiakim into his hands with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So the treasuries from the temple are now taken and put in Marduk's temple, back in Babylon. And the king commanded Asaph, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competence, to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans, because you will be taken to a land in whose people's language you do not understand. Daniel and his 3 friends were either from royal family or they were of noble birth. They were physically attractive, mentally sharp, and spiritually in tuned, despite the condition of the nation, which is interesting. The nation is being taken because of the rebellion and their inability to follow God. Daniel and his friends are kind of the exception to that, because that becomes important again as we get into the book later on. Because of these qualities, they were handpicked for governmental service in Babylon and serving the king, and they were most likely fairly young. Daniel lived at least until the 3rd year of Cyrus, which is 536 BC. So if Daniel was 16 years old when he entered Babylon, that means he lived until he was at least 85. That's the background in a nutshell. And we took a little bit to get there, but that's kind of what's going on. And before we end our time this morning, I don't want to just give you kind of this history lesson on what we're talking about, but I want us to go briefly and see if we can pull out a couple of these elements that we can learn from this. So first, God is sovereign. It's one of the themes of the book of Daniel. And what do we mean when we say that God is sovereign? It's one of those theological terms that sometimes gets thrown around, and maybe we need some help defining it to give clarity on that. Paul David Tripp, in his book, Do You Believe?, helps us give understanding to this teaching with great clarity. He says this: it means that God is in absolute control of his world and everything that happens, without any gaps, limits, interferences, or thwarting of his rule. It means that God alone determines all that will happen and rules the means by which everything will happen. This means that God has never has questions, never is surprised, never is frustrated, never wonders, never is greeted with mystery, never wishes he could have, never looks back with regret, never is hoping, never is waiting, never feels helpless, has nothing he can't figure out, and never finds himself at a loss. No one can back God into a corner, and he is never pressed to do something. There is no authority over him that he has to answer to. He does what he pleases, decides whatever he wants, and acts as he wants. To say God is sovereign is to simply say that God is God and there is no one like him. This becomes more evident in the book of Daniel as we start getting into kings and being rulers, trading places, and those type of things. But again, we never seem to question, it's interesting, we never seem to question this idea when things are going, quote, our way or when things are good, right? It's always when tragedy strikes or when darkness rallies around us and casts shadows over us that we begin to wonder if God is still in control. I'm sure that Daniel and the rest of his exile spent some of this time thinking about it again as they spent this roughly 1,000-mile journey going back. But one of the keys to take away from this is that God is in control. God said back in Deuteronomy, this is exactly what will happen. And wouldn't you know it, this is exactly what happened. And everyone is surprised. So for us, when God says in Philippians that he who began a good work in you will complete it, then that's exactly what will happen. So first, God is sovereign. Second, if I can click through here, God keeps his word. Because God is sovereign, he is able to keep his word, and what God says will come to pass without fail. Because God is in complete control of all aspects of his creation, from the spinning of all planets to the combination of every atom, God will always follow through on what he says, in part because nothing can thwart his efforts, because he's sovereign. One example of this in our overview today is the warning that God gave again to the Israelites in Deuteronomy. All the nations will say, "Why has the Lord done this to this land? What caused the heat of this great anger?" Then people will say, "It is because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of Egypt, and went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods whom they had not known and whom he has not allowed to them. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against the land, bringing upon it all the curses written in this book. And the Lord uprooted them from the land in anger and fury and with great wrath, and cast them into another land, as they are this day." Again, the people should have been completely clear on what was going to happen. God is faithful to keep his word. However, this is kind of a negative example as we give it, as we talk about it. So if we skip ahead from Deuteronomy 29 and skip ahead to Deuteronomy 30, this is kind of, 29 is kind of looking back, like, how did we get here? This is the answer. What do we do about it? Again, comes up at the end of Daniel, but God also addresses that here in Deuteronomy chapter 30 when he says this: "When all these things come upon you, the blessings and the cursings which I have set before you, and you call them to mind, along with all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today, with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you. And he will gather you again from the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. And he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. When you obey the voice of the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes that are written in the book of law, when you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul." The one before was explaining why they were there. This now explains what they do when they get there. Right? God has not forgotten them. God is still sovereign, and God is still faithful to his word. So if God was faithful to this punishment piece, right, God will be faithful to the restoration piece as well. So first, God is sovereign. Second, God is faithful to his word. Third, God disciplines his children. This third and final takeaway from this morning is probably not the point that we're most comfortable with or something that we really like to talk about, but it's something that's here, obviously. However, I want you to think about it for a minute with me. Again, if we go back to our parent idea that we've been talking about, if there was a parent whose children were at that same restaurant, right? You've now come out of the car, you're now in the restaurant, and the family there is just out of control. One of the kids is trying to stand on the table. He's knocking over plates and glasses. The other two are running back and forth in front of the register, nearly knocking over the people as they're trying to pay. And they're almost hitting the server as she rounds the corner. And you turn and you see the parents, and they're just sitting there hanging out. You're wondering what's happening over there at table 42 and what in the world is going on. Wondering why they're ignoring what's happening. They're not upset. They're not addressing the issue. What you may end up thinking is that these parents are unloving and neglectful because they're refusing to address the issues that their kids are dealing. Proverbs 3:11-12 says, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof, for the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights." If you go to Hebrews, the author of Hebrews actually quotes this proverb and then has this to say. Hebrews 12, starting at verse 7. "It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons, for what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, it is in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of the spirits and live? For they disciplined us for the short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness." That's how we got here. And that's hopefully some things that you can kind of take away. That the idea is, again, as we get into the story of the book of Daniel, right? It's not poof, here's Daniel and his three friends. There's a lot that's transpired to get them here. And so now you can maybe relate to Daniel a little bit more as we think about, I don't know this language. I have no idea what color that is because we don't paint stuff that color. What is all this stuff going on, right? And so this helps us as we get into the book later on, hopefully.